Tonight on Mark Latham's Outsiders, we're talking to James Damore, the guy who was sacked from Google for critiquing their left-wing agenda of workplace diversity and political correctness. Also speaking to John Anderson, former Australian Deputy Prime Minister, about all the problems in the modern Australian political system. We've got Margaret Canaan on the show, one of Australia's top prosecutors, to talk about the fake Human Rights Commission report on sexual harassment in our universities. We've got Zeg's Cartoons, the Outsiders Outhouse, and the Left Lunatic of the Week. You know him well. He's an absolute imbecile. All coming up on the show. Stay tuned. Trigger warning viewers, you've entered a very unsafe space. This is Mark Latham's Outsiders, Australia's most politically incorrect news and current affairs show. I'm coming to you in front of the Plaza Hotel in magnificent Rockhampton in Queensland, one of the great outsider destinations. We're going to be talking about very important matters on the show this evening. I won't be having the normal editorial up front because we've got a special treat. James Damore, the guy sacked by Google for speaking the truth about the fraud of the leftist workplace diversity agenda. He's going to be there at the top of the show to talk about all his important issues. We need to understand this, not only out of the unfairness of what happened to him at Google, but as Google consumers. The left-wing bias that spills over into search engines and trending lists and algorithms and all the like. Very, very important interview coming up with James Damore. Can I just remind you to go to our website, marklathamsoutsiders.com, to register for all our activities. And one of the pressing issues on the Australian agenda today, overnight, Yarra Council, one of these loopy left councils in inner Melbourne, has effectively tried to abolish Australia Day. They're saying as a council they'll only have an Indigenous smoking ceremony on the 26th of January, and they'll no longer refer to that day, our national day, as Australia Day. It's a disgrace. It's part of the left-wing march to push back against the value of Western civilisation. Please go to our petition website, saveaustraliaday.com. There it is on the bottom of the screen, saveaustraliaday.com. Sign the petition. We're mounting the campaign to push back against this leftist BS. We need to save our national day. Go to that website, sign the petition and share it with all your friends, saveaustraliaday.com. Very, very important. And in a short while I'll come back with Claire Lehman to talk to James Damore. Welcome back, where I'm joined by Claire Lehman from Rebel Australia, our resident behavioural scientist. Claire, thanks for joining us. We're about to talk to James Damore, and I just want the viewers to get a feel for how important this issue is. James Damore put out this memo, Google's Ideological Echo Chamber, and he started it as follows. I value diversity and inclusion, and not denying that sexism exists, and don't endorse using stereotypes. And he put forward a whole series of positive suggestions, recognising the preference and ability differences between men and women, not making value judgments about them, rather saying this is the reality, and Google can actually improve its performance by taking on his recommendations. He got the sack, he's under attack from the left. What the hell has gone on?
Well, yeah, what his memo has sort of brought out, Mark, is the fact that these issues, which are just scientific issues, are moralised by people in left-wing communities, and Silicon Valley is a very left-leaning community, and it appears that Google extremely so, and it's become sort of an echo chamber, a sort of reinforcing cult-like environment. And so he put out a memo just describing some of the scientific literature which is credible and valid on differences between men and women. And the consensus is that ability differences are quite small, although men have some advantage in spatial reasoning and mechanical reasoning, but differences in interest is quite large. And so there's a very important study, a meta-analysis that shows that women are overwhelmingly interested in work that has to do with people, and men work that has to do with things. So
gadgets, machines, devices. Yep. Well, thanks for joining us, Claire. And now, a very important interview. We're to be joined by James Damore from California. Can I just say you've got a lot of fans and supporters in Australia because you're standing up for merit, you're standing up for classical liberalism, you're standing up for the principles of reason and enlightenment. We really appreciate that. But I've got to ask at a personal level, how are you finding the firestorm, the political firestorm in which you're now embedded? I spent some time in Australian politics, and it's not easy to be in this type of environment. A couple of weeks ago, you're pottering away successfully as a software engineer at Google. Now you're a big political figure internationally. How are you handling that personally, and what do you hope to do in the future?
Yeah, it's all very overwhelming, and it's very confusing seeing how divisive some of these issues are between different sides of the media, and even among some of my friends, where they've now sort of abandoned me. But I've also gotten a lot of support from some really close friends, which is really nice.
Well, you're making new friends and supporters around the world, I can assure you. Now, one of the reasons is that you're dealing in reality. Yesterday in Australia, we had the release of a study by the Australian Institute of Family Studies looking at the vocational preferences of 14 and 15-year-old teenagers. And it's a big study, 10,000 children, longitudinal study, so this is a big reliable survey. And it found for boys, the top 5 occupational ambitions they had were number 1, engineering, number 2, IT, number 3, construction, number 4, automotive technical trade, and the 5th one was sporting life and activities. For girls, total opposite in many respects. Number 1, they wanted to be doctors or dentists. Number 2, teachers. Number 3, lawyers. Number 4, personal services. And the final one here, 5th on the list, was the performance arts and production. Now, isn't this the point that you were trying to make to Google? This is just the reality of the diversity of preference in our world between genders.
Right, yeah, and there's a large difference in things versus people on that list.
And so you were just pointing out that people have different preferences and different interests, and over time this might affect their skills and abilities. But that was interpreted as you saying that women were somehow inferior. Can you clarify what you really meant there?
Yeah, it was really just saying that on average, men have a higher interest in thing-oriented occupations. And so it's seeing that tech is 80% men isn't really saying that there's just all this sexism against women that's holding women back. It's just innate differences in preference.
Yeah.
And how does this go to corporate performance, James? Because I would have thought if you're trying to shoehorn into various jobs people who aren't all that interested on gender grounds, the group as a whole is not that interested in certain types of professions. If you're bringing people in who aren't committed, doesn't that actually diminish corporate performance instead of the propaganda of the diversity people who say that they're improving performance?
Yeah, at least anecdotally, there are many cases of women that join coding just to show that women can do it, but then they realize that they really just weren't as obsessed as some of the other people, and so they ended up dropping out.
Yeah, I think, James, that's a really interesting point, because Silicon Valley presumably has a high quotient of young men who are on the Asperger's autism spectrum who are literally obsessed with technical things like coding. And it's unfair to assume that you can just pluck normal people, and women on average are more normal, and say, be this obsessed.
Yeah, and even I found that I wasn't as obsessed as some of my coworkers in technology.
Yeah.
So there really is a lot of people that will spend all their free time just coding and looking at other computer technology, and that really gives them a leg up when it comes to working in the tech sector.
And in terms of measuring these outcomes, I notice at the final page of your memo that you circulated, you write that we haven't been able to measure any effect of our unconscious bias training, and it has the potential for overcorrecting or backlash, especially if made mandatory. Why weren't they measuring outcomes here? And is there inside Google any sense of performance measurement that diversity is actually a positive or a negative, or it's more a religion, an article of faith?
Yeah, it's largely just a religion or a dogma that they've been pushing on us. They have tried to measure benefits, but they really haven't been able to measure any benefits from this. And for example, the unconscious bias training, there is a lot of potential for backfiring, especially when it's mandatory and you really telling people, oh no, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. People don't like being told that they're sexist and racist.
Yeah, and it has the potential to cause resentment. Now, all of the evidence you put forward in your memo, James, is scientifically valid evidence. It's, you cited a lot of meta-analyses and systematic reviews, and I'm wondering, were the Google management aware of this research and are just ignoring it, or were they not in touch with the scientific consensus on these issues?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, at least part of it was that they were just reacting to the angry mob.
Yeah.
So even if they were aware that this was scientifically valid, they still had to do something about it because there was just so many angry people. And I think those angry people weren't aware of it, though.
Right. Can you tell us more about the angry people? So what actually happened? I mean, I'm not aware of what happened internally.
Yeah, so I shared it with some people. It was about a month ago. I shared it with some people. I shared it with the diversity programs. There was just good reasoned discussion. But then once it became viral within Google, there were a lot of people just shaming me and sending nasty messages and just saying, oh, no, this is harmful. This is Nazi propaganda. This is misogynist. And it was really misrepresentation of what I was trying to do, which was actually helping Google and trying to use science to at least address the gender gap.
Yeah, and you would assume that helping them develop some more effective diversity policies would be good for the bottom line, as well as diversity. Was that your assumption when you were writing the memo?
Yeah, I thought so. I mean, generally, using evidence is good.
You're very old-fashioned.
Yeah.
Well, that's very striking. I've read the memo several times, including this morning, and it seemed to me to be a positive attempt to try and help the company. But you've been branded not a microaggressor, but a macroaggressor, and unfortunately, tragically, been sacked. And I notice on page 8 of the memo, you write of Google as having created a silent, psychologically unsafe environment, and then in your Wall Street Journal article, you wrote of it as being like a cult-like workplace. Can you just elaborate on that? It all sounds very unhealthy.
Yeah, so psychological safety is one thing that Google has found to be predictive of teamwork and worker productivity, and it has a lot to do with being able to speak up and not feeling like or fearing that you'll be harshly judged. And this really shows how psychologically unsafe the environment is, where you can't speak up against any of this dogma because you will be harshly judged, and in my case, fired. And so, I mean, it happens at the large scale and also just small scale. You can't say anything that's against it, otherwise you'll be shamed.
James, have you had people supporting you through back channels, but in public denouncing the memo?
So I haven't had anyone that was actually living a double life, but there have been many people that were privately supporting me. And most of the denouncement was this public virtue signaling.
Right.
Well, I think the public support in Australia is with you, and we're very worried in this country and internationally about the loss of the Enlightenment, the age of reason. You've described yourself as a classical liberal who values individualism and reason. Really what you're saying, I mean, at one level it's hard to get our minds around this, but inside Google and like organisations, there's a rolling back of the principles of evidence-based judgments, of reason, of enlightenment, of engaging in debate. This is scary stuff, isn't it?
Definitely, and I really wish that Google was more evidence-based rather than just dogma-based on these types of issues.
Well, I think it's scary for our society, but do we need to be worried outside of Google in terms of their management of their information product? For instance, I put into the Google search engine last night the phrase gays opposed to gay marriage, and the top 5 items were actually pro-gay marriage, including 18 arguments against gay marriage and why they're bollocks. I then went to the Bing search engine and put in the same phrase, gays opposed to gay marriage, and the top 5 were actually against gay marriage, headed by I'm gay and I oppose same-sex marriage. Should we be worried about these search engines and the algorithms and the trending lists, that they too have been jaundiced by this cult-like political environment?
Yes, I don't know about the actual search algorithms, but there have been ways of, for example, how we judge whether a video is harmful or offensive. There's a lot of room for political bias to go in there, and there's been a lot of at least anecdotal evidence of right-wing videos being demonetized on YouTube, and where they've lost subscribers, and there's a lot of conspiracy theories behind that, but a lot of it could be just that we're choosing what is harmful based on their own political bias of, oh, this right-wing stuff is harmful, but shaming white males, that's great.
That's fine. That's the orthodoxy. So can you just elaborate there? How much discretion internally do the Google staff have for making a value judgment about what's a morally sound video and what's not, or what should appear on a search engine?
I think it may not be coming directly from the top, but there are very subtle ways in which it can be shown, just because what offends you personally does have a lot to do with your political orientation.
So we should be worried about this cult-like environment spilling over into free public access to reasonable information.
Yeah, I think there's definitely possibilities that it may encroach in our ability to access information, and it's something that Google really needs to address.
And what can we do about it? I mean, we're all opposed to the idea of heavy state regulation of the internet, but it's becoming apparent, Facebook and now Google, YouTube, we can't really leave it in the hands of corporate leftists who engage in acts of shaming and dogma and ideological obsession, and allow that to spill over into their work management. What can we do about it?
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure that out, actually, because I would like to help to change this. And I'm trying, at least with my few contacts within Google, to help, but I'm still trying to figure out how those on the outside can help influence Google and help it change.
Well, and James, do you think that just fostering diversity of opinion and thinking about diversity not just in terms of gender and skin color, but also in terms of viewpoint, do you think that would be a healthy shift for the company?
Yeah, it's definitely, and I tried to bring that up in the document, although that was one thing that was lost in all the outrage.
Yeah, I mean, the title of your memo was the ideological echo chamber, Google's ideological echo chamber. But have you felt that other people are craving more viewpoint diversity within the company and within the larger Silicon Valley community?
There definitely are some people, especially those that don't hold to this dogma, but those that are in it really do feel like it's the good thing to do to silence opposing viewpoints. Okay. And that's what we've seen in a lot of the university protests, at least in America.
And is there a large sort of majority who are not really that political, but are sort of scared of those who are more political?
Yeah, so there's a small percent that are very angry and very activist, and then there's many that just go with the crowd and don't want to be publicly shamed.
Yeah, that would be my expectation. And so do you feel that speaking out the way that you have has sort of given a voice or given perhaps other people courage to also speak out?
Yes, at least in some way, but although it did show an example of what goes wrong when you do speak out.
That's right.
Well, I hope you continue to speak out, James. I think you're the Martin Luther of our time, because there's a lot of people worried about the loss of meritocracy, the loss of fair play, the loss of reason, the loss of enlightenment, all replaced by political correctness and identity politics. And I notice in your memo you had a critique of communism and why it fell over. My own view is communism fell over because it tried to resist the inevitable laws of human nature. I think the identity and diversity project, so-called, will fall over for similar reasons. So I hope you can work out those ways to encourage institutional reform at Google and other places. So thanks for joining us this evening. We really appreciate your time and all the very best for the future. You're a hero.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Great to be here.
Thanks, James, and thanks, Claire.
Thanks.
We'll be back in a short moment with the former Australian Deputy Prime Minister, John Anderson. Welcome back to Mark Latham's Outsiders, where I'm delighted to be joined by John Anderson, who was a member of the House of Representatives for 18 years and most notably leader of the National Party and Australia's Deputy Prime Minister between 1999 and 2005. John, thanks for joining us here.
Good to be with you, Mark.
We used to fight like cat and dog in the Parliament, but it's a remarkable aspect of modern politics that people who've come from a conservative, libertarian and in my case, social democratic background have united now in concern about political correctness, identity politics, cultural Marxism. Peter Baldwin, who was on the left of the Labor Party, has made the same point. We're all on the same page. And recently, in a very impressive interview on the ABC, you made the comment that our political system is now close to broken, and you're worried, as a former national leader and elder statesman of the National Party, that Australia is fracturing as a society. Can you elaborate?
All Western cultures appear to be fracturing. They all appear to have lost sight of the things that bind them together. They focus on the things that divide them. They're all into deep cultural loathing of their own background. Churchill warned in 1934 that if you don't believe and pass on the story of your civilization, its heroes, its beliefs, you're in effect saying they're null and void. You're leaving young people open to the dictums of Karl Marx. You can lead them anywhere. And so I'm beginning to wonder, as an Australian who cares passionately about this place, no secret that I was not particularly enamoured with political life. I gave it my best for 18 years. Why? Because I love this country. I know it sounds trite, but it's true. I look at it now and I think, we don't even know how to have a civilised conversation with ourselves in a local community. And that translates out into fractured and broken politics. People everywhere say, can't they get their act together and lead? But we're gridlocking the system ourselves. You stop and think about what we're doing in the Senate. We're gridlocking it because we don't trust them, because we don't like them, because we don't trust and like one another and we have no shared values anymore. We've got to fix this fast or we'll lose an awful lot of freedoms, economic, social, even strategic, for our kids and our grandkids. And I mean fast, Mark. We can't muck around like this.
No, it's very urgent because the leftist march through institutions has happened at a remarkable pace.
And very comprehensively.
And institutions now, so-called gender diversity and quotas in the Defence Force, the Fire Brigade in New South Wales, which we've spoken about on this show. It's this identity politics and cultural Marxism is right through universities, Human Rights Commission, public broadcasters, political parties in large amount. The leftist march through institutions, how do we fight it and push back against it?
You know, there's a view in some quarters in America now where this is, you wouldn't think it had happened in America because it's much more sort of conservative society in many ways, or we think it is, than us, but it has. So you've now got in many institutions, that's up to 13 out of 14 academics, I'm told, in many major American academic institutions will be left or left of centre, overwhelmingly support one side of politics. They seem incapable of understanding that no position, no matter how passionately held, is valid until you've understood the other position.
This is your conversation with Jonathan Haidt.
Absolutely. He makes that point very, very strongly. And of course, he came out of the left. He'd probably now call himself centre.
Mm-hmm.
But he makes the point that without quality debate, without knowing the other side, you can't have a quality debate. Now, I make the point, you will never get good public policy without a decent debate. So if you want to know what's wrong with Australia, I think we've just actually captured both of them. The first thing is we're not unified anymore on the core things that we ought to be. You see, what happens with all this talk about diversity and so forth? It really, Mark, is all about trying to highlight our differences. I'm all for recognising people who are different from me, and I mean that very sincerely. I represent a lot of Aboriginal people. I care very much about Aboriginal people, whatever it happens to be. But we've got to emphasise what we have in common, because it's a nasty big world out there. It doesn't take any prisoners. There's another recession coming. There always is. We're going to be in a mess because of the way we've been so irresponsible.
Do you think there's a crisis in conservatism, in that the conservative instinct is to preserve institutions, institutions of value, family, church, parliament, universities. But now given the leftist takeover of many of these institutions, how do conservatives go about reclaiming institutions when their instinct is to conserve? And it seems to me there's a bit of confusion among conservatives as to what to do at this critical time in our history.
Well, let me make a couple of points. Firstly, I think Peter Baldwin's right. We've moved into a new era. I don't think the old labels work anymore. I actually think now we need a new definition, somewhere around the idea of people who are still committed to the idea of evidence-based, reasoned debate, and those who think you win a debate by sneering and by using false news and by using other facts, because it seems now that on every issue there's more than one set of facts. I mean, that's ridiculous in itself. I think we need to redefine things. But the second thing I just say again, we've got to find some national unity. We've got to learn to debate again. The old adage, I may disagree with you, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. We now live in a world, and this goes to this heart of the new divisions we need to make, where the rule seems to be if I disagree with you, I'll fight to the death to make certain you don't have the right to put it.
To silence you, yeah.
Now, for a conservative, there ought to be an immediate, whoa, hang on here. The basis of our civilization has its roots in a Judeo-Christian worldview, is that everyone has worth and dignity. You and I might have fought like Kilkenny cats, but I could never have philosophically said I must silence him because he has no right to speak. You have dignity and worth as an Australian citizen. So you have a right to put your... And then when you put your idea on the table, we do the idea over, not each other.
Do you find this problem now in the same-sex marriage debate, for instance?
Large. It really, really worries me. This one really concerns me because we were told that the defenders of traditional marriage shouldn't be given a say. They ought to be silenced because they'd be homophobic, they'd reveal hatred, and they'd be bigoted. But overwhelmingly, the attack on freedoms of speech, on the rights of others to speak, and even on a freedom of association, they've overwhelmingly come from the advocates of change. I sometimes feel like I'm an alien living in my own country, and I meet people all the time who say that. What's happening? It's part of a larger problem. It's a microcosm, if you like, of the way in which we can't, you know, we've had tolerance preached at us as a great value for so long. I've never seen such intolerance.
Yeah, the left that used to promote tolerance are now using it in a sort of upside-down world as a weapon against people. And
you know,
it seems to me
Kelly,
Christians are being depicted now as freakish, sort of personal vilification. There's something wrong with you if you don't believe in and support gay marriage.
Well, you're seeing a lot of that. So let's clearly understand. You know, the biggest bit of sophistry that's going around at the moment is that this change is minor and it will only affect a few people who will have access to marriage. If there's one thing that proponents of change, if you listen to them, are really saying, and one thing that opponents of change are agreeing on, is that these changes are really big.
Profound, yeah.
So my message to the people in the middle on this one is please vote. We've got to have some unity again. We've got to have the credibility of having known that the majority of people have been able to have their say. And the second thing is that don't vote until you know, or vote, but make sure you know you've heard and understood the arguments. Let me just put this very simple proposition. The reality is now that we live in a society where our laws and our institutions were built around the idea that marriage was about for the benefit of two spouses and their children and society. We're now simply saying at the most basic, no, it's not about those things, it's just about love. So that is a massive shift in the attitude towards our most fundamental institution. To pretend that that shift will not bring over time very real changes is to firstly deny reality. Secondly, it's to deny what's happening internationally, where on the slow burn you can see all sorts of freedoms now under
Yeah, and it's a radical change because the left used to argue against all forms of marriage, and actually towards the back of her memoirs, Julia Gillard explained her opposition to same-sex marriage, where she said she was opposed to all forms of marriage in her life and others, because she thought marriage was an institution of oppression and patriarchy, and now they've flipped right over to say, well, everyone's got to be married no matter your sexuality.
Well, when I was at university, that was the line. Marriage ought to be disposed of. Maybe you can tell me, at what point did the left decide that it was a bedrock institution?
I think at the point where they embraced identity politics, where the left got into the habit of thinking the main narrative is that the dominant social institution is so-called white male privilege, and every other group supposedly repressed by white male privilege has got to be supported. So if gays want gay marriage, tick that off. If Islam wants certain conditions and Sharia law in Australia, we'll tick that off. That's worth supporting. Every single non-white male group gets what it wants under the rubric of leftist identity politics. I think that's the point where they flipped. And it is a dramatic 180-degree turn. They're shameless about the hypocrisy of it. And now they march forward through this plebiscite vote.
You know, one of the things, I'm a sixth-generation Australian, I come from rural Australia. One of the things that we always had drummed into us was modesty. You know, you mustn't be on yourself. And arrogance is a really despicable characteristic in your neighbour. And so don't be arrogant. You know, Paul Kelly noted this. In the name of narcissism, now we justify all sorts of things that we would have called being on yourself.
Oh, yeah, up
an
yourself.
Extraordinary superiority.
Normally against
and I make this point to my friends, and I do have friends who have a different view, and family members who have a different view of me on this one. I would have thought, given what we've seen in Britain and America now, where the elites, the people who really do send out that aura that they know better than the rest of us, command and the people revolt. I'm not certain if I were advocating gay marriage, same-sex marriage, that I'd want to be running the risk of looking like an elite telling everybody else what to do.
Oh, that's how they look.
Well, and then they run off to the High Court, even at the late time, to try and stop the Australian people having a say. Why don't they want the Australian people to have a say? And Mark, the other question for me is, why will, if we live in a democracy, if you want to shift the balance of power further towards the state, and make no mistake, that's what this measure will do, it will entrench more power in the hands of the state. It does shift rights. It will move freedoms from one group to another. In a democracy, I think you have the right to express your views. If that's what you want, then please be honest about it.
Well, democracy is being vilified in many places. I could ask you what's happening in the world of corporate culture in Australia, and can we bring up on screen this remarkable memo that's gone out at Clayton Utz, John Howard's old law firm in Sydney, where they're offering counselling for people of LGBTI background who feel shaken and anxious about the fact we're having a vote on same-sex marriage. There's the memo from Clayton Utz, used to be regarded as a conservative law firm, where now, John, they're positioning a democratic vote. The democratic process is said to be scary, causing mental anxiety. I mean, what's happened here when even firms like this are vilifying the whole notion of democracy as a valued institution, an essential institution for the stability of our society?
It's a good question. Let me just walk this one through gently in the first instance by saying, if there are people hurting in their firm, then they ought to be concerned about that. That's the first point I'd make. The second point I'd make is that you and I have been subjected to many, many, many polls, and they can be brutal. And I'm going to be honest, don't know about you, there are times when I needed a mate to go and talk to, because they can be pretty tough when you're personally feeling threatened or you've been put down.
These are people working in a law firm.
Yeah, well, that's the next point I'm going to make.
You know, democracy freaks you out.
Yeah, and you know, a lot of lawyers might stop and think about how they argue their cases and whether they actually stick to the evidence and the facts. But the other thing I want to say is there's two sides to this. Only this morning I was talking to a man who rang me about a radio interview I'd done. And in conversation, he's a pretty senior guy in a major capital city. I won't say any more than that. He said, you know, I've got two young people at the moment who are working in the city in a law firm. And they've come to me for personal counselling because they have reservations about same-sex marriage. They don't even feel they can walk into the tea room. And one company, they're supposed to wear a white ribbon, I gather. I don't know how many colours we're going to have.
The rainbow.
To show their support.
Yeah.
And they don't want to.
Yeah.
And in this age when apparently we're celebrating diversity, they're not allowed to hold that opinion.
No, there's no
they don't
diversity
feel
of
free.
Opinion. No, that's
so they're seeking counselling. There's two sides to this.
Yeah.
And it highlights something else.
Wow.
It highlights something else. And that is that one of the big issues we have in this country is that depression and attempted suicide rates, actual suicides and so forth amongst young people are running very, very high. It's one of the national things we need to confront as a nation. But I think our problem is we're not giving them a narrative, we're not giving them a story, we're not giving them vision, we're not giving them hope. Where is our story as a nation?
Shouldn't we be teaching resilience rather than fragility? We should be encouraging. The old Australian ethic was to be tough, strong, pioneering, go settle the country. You know, she'll be right. You know, I might have a few worries, but she'll be right tomorrow. Haven't we lost our national resilience to the point where Clayton Utz is offering personal counselling because of a democratic vote? I worry about the fragility of the nation. I know anxiety and depression are real life problems, but in our schools, our institutions, our whole public narrative. Haven't we lost our strength as a country?
All right, well, let me be really frank about this. I think the answer to that is yes, and I think it's very dangerous. And I actually think we've gone from being a sort of culture that honoured dignity and I suppose courage and self-reliance and sacrifice to one where, if you want to, you know, we celebrate that every Anzac Day. That's what we celebrate. And young people go out in large masses. Unfortunately today there's a strong element amongst the people who seem to control the debate in the public square that says if you want to be elevated, you've got to be able to paint yourself as a victim.
Victimology. Yeah.
And the problem is that if you think of yourself as a victim, unless I affirm you in your victimhood, you see, I'm hating you. And on the other hand, if I give you what you need, you won't say thank you because you're entitled to it. So I do think we need, I come back to this issue again, I think we need to focus on what unites us as Australian, what makes us Australian. And a remarkable thing, you know, the Latham Institute, a big think tank in England last year, did some serious work on populations around the world and how they saw themselves. Do you know the Indonesians people are far more likely to say, I'll have a good life, I'll get ahead, it'll be meaningful, and so forth, than Australians and New Zealanders are? And you think how privileged we are. Maybe it's time we had a great big, I'm grateful to be Australian Day, instead of focusing all the time on the things that are worrying us.
Yeah, well, it's Australia Day, which we fight for here at Mark Latham's Outsiders. We've got to defend our National Day. Unfortunately, John, we're out of time. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you for re-entering the public sphere, making these points. I think it's great that someone like you is emerging in the media as a spokesperson. A lot of Australians are very, very worried about the country's direction. And what you've got to say is a valuable source of comfort, I think, to a lot of people. Your old side of politics, the new sides of politics. Thanks for joining us here.
Good to see you.
And after this short break, we'll be back with Zeg's Cartoons and the Outsiders Outhouse. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Mark Latham's Outsiders, and it's one of our favourite segments every week. The viewer feedback about Zeg's Cartoons is magnificent. Not many shows have got a cartoonist in residence, but we've got the great Zeg, and this week his first cartoon is a reflection on our previous guest, our earlier guest, James Damore. This is how Zeg takes the sacking at Google. Anti-affirmative action thinking detected, you're fired. That's the Google production line. James Damore said it's a cult-like environment. Well, they've got a production line there where if they detect any form of reasoned, logical, realistic thinking, you're out of Google. A real big worry. In Zeg's second cartoon, he's worried about the politics that's coming into the Uber industry. We've all heard of Sheba, which is a female-only Uber service. The men are too scary to drive the ladies around, and Zeg here is saying that you've got a couple of Labor and Green senators going to a North Korean gay marriage in Martin Place tent city gathering. And Uber will be there, politicised these days in just 10 minutes. Thanks, Zeg, for your wonderful cartoons. Lightens up the show with a bit of political content as well. Really is fantastic. And now, of course, we've got the Outsiders Outhouse. Again, Zeg has got the drawing. He's got me on the thunderbox there, the outhouse. Perhaps the only place in Australia now where we've got total freedom of thought and expression. And don't forget to send in your comments about the issues of the day or comments about the show, things you like, things you don't like, to mark.latham@therebel.media. That's the email address, mark.latham@therebel.media. I really welcome all the feedback I get from our many viewers, not only in Australia but internationally now with Rebel Media. Our first item this evening comes from a viewer in Victoria. He doesn't want to give his name because he's out there desperately looking for work, and here's why. He wants to highlight a few key points. The first is, at my send-off, drinks with colleagues after my retrenchment, some previous senior managers from Royal Automobile Club of Victoria, with white males also retrenched, told me that the new CEO and the new people and culture manager, a woman, have openly made comments about getting rid of the male, pale and stale men from RACV. I've never heard of that expression before, and our friend from Victoria was sick even typing it into his computer, male, pale and stale. Talk about the denigration of white men. He estimates that nearly 100 people have been retrenched from RACV since April last year, although the press don't mention it, as the organisation has the largest media marketing spend in Victoria, over $12 million. He goes on to write, I'm currently going through an outplacement firm And when we have discussion groups, the room is full of middle-aged white men who've also been retrenched from their jobs. At the last discussion group, there were 15 men and just 2 women. I know this is a small sample, but I believe it's representative of all the insidious practices that mainstream Australians know nothing about. Well, our friend in Victoria, mainstream Australians are finding out more and more about it, especially these disgusting expressions like pale, male and stale men who are punted out of organisations simply because of their skin colour and their gender. Thanks for sending in that viewpoint. And I also thank John Marsh in Brisbane, Queensland, who writes as follows. Hi Mark, love your show and its non-PC view of the world. As a grandfather of 2 young boys just beginning their educational journey, the lack of proficiency in the 3 R's as produced by our current crop of loony left educators worries me greatly. We'll join the club there, John. As an example of how far we've slipped, I thought you might be interested in this 8th grade exam paper set for students in Salina, Kansas in the United States, way back in 1895. Grammar. Wow. How we've lost the rigour of the education system. Look at that grammar test there. Give the 9 rules for the use of capital letters. Name the parts of the speech and define those that have no modifications, verse, stanza and paragraph, and on it goes. On it goes, a great example of how we have lost rigour in the education system, replaced by fashionable leftism. So thanks very much to John Marsh from Brisbane for sending in that document and his viewpoint. And finally, Cheryl of Adelaide, a very, very concerned parent, also writes in about the education system as follows. My 15-year-old son's Year 10 English class at a private Christian college, has just begun undertaking a unit of study called Specific Film Genre. There's a study in mockumentary, so-called. They've been shown Michael Moore's movie Bowling for Columbine and given a detailed 7-page brief where they have to answer some left-leaning questions. They have to give multiple answers of how American society is gripped by fear. Lastly, students are required to tie everything together to show how, and she quotes, Moore sees a connection between a competitive society in which people are afraid and violent reactions like Columbine. Really? They're blaming competition in society, capitalism, for gun violence, massacres at Columbine. When contacted, Cheryl writes, the teacher was unable to see any irony in showing high school kids in a documentary about a real-life high school massacre. He also dismissed my concerns about the film being highly disturbing and negative. Mark, you've inspired my family to instigate our own lefty loony Teacher of the Week segment each Friday night at tea time. This English teacher is our first winner. Well, unfortunately, Cheryl, he's a worthy winner. We have a lot of left lunacy. I mean, I don't think it's right to tie Columbine massacre to the nature of American society and its economic system of competition and capitalism, but that's what's happening even in a Christian college in Adelaide. Real worrying times in the Australian education system. Now finally in this segment we have our ever popular left lunatic of the week, and Zeg's got the drawing. He looks a bit like Mr. Bean. Zeg's got him right. It's Sam Dastiari joins that glittering parade of left lunatics. The canvas is becoming very crowded, from Clementine Ford on the far right through to Julia Baird there on the far left, and Warren Ench with his rainbow tie. There's Sam Dastiari promoting his book, One Halal of a Story. Sam Dastiari's got the new book. He was out there at the Channel 7 morning show at the beginning of this month, and he was asked about the recent terror raids in Sydney. Very worrying development. ISIS gave instructions to the alleged terrorist suspects, and they were planning to place a bomb in the luggage of their brother, blow him up, and an Etihad flight with 500 people on board. Sam Dastiari was asked, what do we do about this? And here's his remarkable reply.
I really do think there has to be the language of engagement, engaging with leaders, engaging with people. Look, I went and got my book halal certified. I went and got my book halal, I got it properly halal certified, right? And part of that in jest, but part of it just making the point that, you know, we have to start bringing these communities into the mainstream.
Really? Left lunacy? Sam Dastiari's solution to radical Islamic terrorism is halal certification of his book? Wow. Talk about trivialising the debate. Talk about having no answers to a serious problem. Halal certification of a book. This guy's an absolute clown, from Shanghai Sam donations to sneering at modest housing stock in Western Sydney. Puts in shocker after shocker after shocker, and a very worthy winner of the Left Lunatic of the Week award. So stay viewing. Thanks for watching the show. After a short break, we'll be back with Australia's best known and most successful prosecutor, Margaret Canaan. Welcome back to Mark Latham's Outsiders, where it's a great pleasure to be joined by Margaret Canaan. Thank you, Margaret, for joining us. You're
Hello,
one of
Mark.
Australia's most successful prosecutors. You've got the scalps on your belt: Dolly Dunn, Philip Bell, the Kay brothers, Bilal Scaff, Graham Reeves, the butcher of Bega, and on the list goes. But for a lot of people, particularly in my house, where we're great fans of the show Janet King, it's said that the Janet King character is based on your good self, and there are a lot of similarities. How do you find that show?
Well, of course I love it, and I'm a great friend of Marta Dusseldorp.
Are you? Okay.
I met her when Nick Cowdery, the former Director of Public Prosecutions, asked her or invited her to come into the office, and he introduced us, and so she followed me around to various courts. So if she's taken on any of my characteristics, I'm very proud of that.
Fantastic. Now, you've made some very important comments recently about the incidence of sexual assault and sexual harassment on university campuses. And with Bettina Arndt, who we know well on this program, you made the point in the Australian newspaper that women are 100 times safer on a university campus than in the general community. That's what the official crime statistics show. So as a prosecutor, someone who's dedicated your professional life to the law, you know these stats. Why then do you think the Human Rights Commission went down the path of this exaggerated report that's been produced to make out that just about every young man on a university campus is some kind of sexual predator? It's
puzzling and it's disappointing, as if boys aren't in enough strife from the way schools are going now. Girls are coming top in many more subjects than boys are at the HSC level. And there are more, 60% of students in universities are now women. And so they're doing much better. And that's probably derived from the unfortunate lack of male teachers at an early stage. And so learning becomes something that girls do, but boys don't do so well. So as if they haven't got enough baggage in that department, even when they get to university, there are these spurious figures going around. It seems that it must have been very disappointing for the people behind these advocacy research projects to find that women were really very safe in universities, to the point where that you can count on the fingers of one hand, probably a butcher's hand, how many proper sexual assaults there are in universities per year, because the studies were self-selecting. People volunteered to enter the studies, and they were permitted to talk about sexual assaults or sexual harassment that they'd suffered on the way to uni, at parties that were nothing to do with uni, or even things that had happened to them before they ever became students at university.
Yeah, it's totally exaggerated, the statistics produced by Kate Jenkins at the Human Rights Commission, but also the redefinition of the meaning of sexual harassment. Now, you've locked up serious sexual assault perpetrators, you've locked up rapists, you know how serious these issues are. Do you feel that it is starting to trivialise the definition of sexual harassment to include jokes, staring, asking for dates, and sexually suggestive gifts? So do you think here we're losing a sense of the real problem? Because the net has been redefined so widely that it's being trivialised.
It's been lumped together as sexual assault. Well, sexual assault is a very serious crime. Sexual assault is punishable by many years in prison, but it is such a serious crime that it must be proved at a high level to the criminal standard of beyond reasonable doubt, and can't be just something that's easily an accusation easily levelled and not properly proved, because that takes away people's fundamental human rights. So it's a very unfortunate thing for genuine victims of serious sexual assault in the community to have that downgraded in effect by these types of studies, because potential jurors may think, well, sexual assault might mean staring or a joke or some sort of...
Well, it's interesting you say that. So you're fearful that this campaign against young men to depict them as sexual predators, even if they just crack a joke or stare at an attractive woman, this might spill over into the justice system at large, and we're losing the presumption of innocence for young men.
We're trivialising the whole notion. And sexual assault is a serious thing. It can't be lumped together with these more minor problems. It was interesting to read from Janice Fiumenko, who wrote a book called Sons of Feminism about what's going on the campuses. Boys who are nerdy or awkward in their natural approaches to young women to ask them out are regarded as creepy, and that even becomes something that's liable to be complained of. But sexual assault is something that should be left with our courts. Our courts are very, very successful in determining those things. If these things are happening, go to the police and report them and have them decided by a jury of 12 people. These moves afoot to institute little tribunals on universities, which would be staffed by people with an interest in inflating the statistics about sexual assault because it keeps them in a job, and it makes them a bit more, their work more important if they keep coming up with more proven sexual abuse statistics or cases. That's not the proper forum. For a genuine crime, the proper forum is still the courts. The courts, we look for diversity. There's nothing more diverse in our society as a tribunal of fact than a jury. 12 people with men and women, old and young, people from all kinds of socio-economic backgrounds, and most importantly, from different racial derivations. So we have 12 people. What we mustn't have is prejudice, the prejudging of these types of offences, and juries are warned against that from the start. Not to be prejudiced. A judge will say, wait, suspend your decision about this until all the evidence is in, and you'll hear evidence from one side and the other, not just one side, which I understand some of these university tribunals are interested in only looking to see whether the accusation is plausible.
Yeah, well, we're losing that sense of fairness, the fair treatment of people under the law, which is one of the foundations of our civilisation. And one of our viewers, a student at Deakin University in Victoria, has sent through the new course material that he's been made to undertake called Consent Matters, an online course. Consent Matters is covering sexual consent, communication and relationships and bystander intervention. There's 4 modules. The first is thinking about consent, the second is support, and on it goes. Now, what does it say about the university system that the students there, the best and brightest in Australia, grown adults, been through all the instruction and moral lessons in family life and the school system, that they've now got to undertake a course to establish the meaning of consent? Isn't this
it's
just,
really
got to the point of being ridiculous?
Well, that's right, because consent is certainly a fairly simple concept, but what we do find with some allegations, that even a recent one which arose in a university in Sydney and resulted in a criminal case, and the accused was acquitted. There was a long area in the night where the young woman in question couldn't account for, she had no memory of it because of alcohol consumption. Now, I'm no wowser, Mark, but really, if you want to be sure about the consent situation, you've got to know what's gone on throughout the whole night, because you can't prove that you haven't conveyed consent in that missing period. You can't prove that beyond reasonable doubt if you don't remember. So there's still, it's not all one-sided. There is personal responsibility to be taken on here, and people, when one is thinking of consent, one can hardly accuse someone of operating without consent if that they were non-compos mentis for part of the night.
Yeah, well, congratulations on your work, Margaret, because not only have you locked up some real bad buggers in New South Wales and done important work more broadly, you're a voice of common sense for the fair treatment of men and women in society. Young men in particular are copping a lot of propaganda against them. So I'm glad you're standing up for fair treatment, which is the Australian way.
Yes,
thanks for coming on the show,
rule
unfortunately, and the rule of law. We've run out of time.
Thank you.
But thank you, viewers, for watching the show. We'll be back next Wednesday night at 8 p.m. for Mark Latham's Outsiders. Please join us then.